13. Code X. The night the Lees told me about their post-war experiences, I remember saying, because I did not know what to say, that must have been terrible, and Foua gave me a brief, opaque look, and said, yes. It was very sad. But when we were running from Laos, at least we hoped that our lives would be better. It was not as sad as after Liao went to Fresno and got sick. At first I thought I had misunderstood her. In Laos, Foua and Nao Kao had lost 3 children in 3 years. They had dodged bullets, land mines, and walls of fire. They had left their village behind, and then their country, knowing they would never see them again. How could anything, even the catastrophic illness of their favorite child, be worse than that? But I had not misunderstood her. Violence, starvation, destitution, exile, and death were, however horrific, within the sphere of known, or at least conceivable, tragedies. What had happened to Liao was outside that sphere. After 11 days in the pediatric intensive care unit at Valley Children's Hospital, Liao was transferred to MCMC by ambulance on December 5, 1986. She was examined by Dave Schneider, a second-year resident with a reputation for being brainy and nervous. In his examination note, Dave described Leah as a comatose, overweight Laotian girl whose admitting diagnoses were severe hypoxic brain damage, Pseudomonas septicemia, severe seizure disorder, status post-disseminated intravascular coagulation, status post-septic shock. I was on PEDS rotation, Dave recalled, and when I heard Leah Lee was coming back from Fresno, basically brain dead, my heart sank. I didn't know the family very well, but I'd heard that they were non-compliant and difficult. Everyone had. I still have this vision of Leah when she got here, just lying in the bed and not looking anything like she used to. She was very hot and febrile. Her eyes were partially rolled back into her head, and she was breathing irregularly and way too fast. She had a lot of mucus and junk in her throat, but it was almost impossible to suction her because her jaw muscles were clamped shut. She wasn't making anything in the way of purposeful movements. Her legs were extended and her arms were alternating between being extended and flexed up to her chest, which is a sign of very weird and ominous stuff going on in the motor strip of the cerebral cortex. She did withdraw from painful stimuli, like when I squeezed tightly on her fingernail beds. Patients usually tell you to get the hell away when you do that. Leah couldn't tell me to go to hell, though on some level I'm sure she wished I would. Leah was admitted to the pediatric unit. I remember the first time I went up to see her, said Peggy Philp. She was awful. Leah had been a real cute little kid. I mean, she had bad seizures, but she was so alive, and now, she was just, well, there, but not peaceful and asleep looking, like you might expect with a coma. I mean, it would be one thing if she lay there like Sleeping Beauty, all pretty and comfortable, but she didn't. She seemed to be in pain. She'd stiffen whenever you touched her. She was struggling. She made terrible, loud noises when she breathed, Peggy demonstrated with a torturous rattling wheeze, and I kept thinking, God, she can't go on like this. This is exhausting her. She is going to wear herself out and die any minute. I remember being real angry at Terry Hutchison, Leah's neurologist in Fresno, you know. God, you sent me this. When Peggy finished talking, I turned to Neil to ask what his impressions had been. He shifted uneasily in his chair. Well, I didn't see her right away. I knew she'd been transferred back to our care to die. There she was. And that was what I had been afraid of. And I was just so, I mean, that episode in the emergency room burnt me out. It emotionally drained me. And facing Leah was real difficult for me at that point. So I took care of her, interjected Peggy. You did. I mean, you probably took care of her almost exclusively. I probably chose to avoid it a little bit. More than a little bit. I chose to avoid it. I have to admit, I bailed out. It took Neil 3 days, walking past Leah's room innumerable times, before he could bring himself to look at the patient who had dominated his professional life and his private thoughts for much of 4 years. I asked him what he found when he finally saw her. She was in a vegetative state, but that was one angry vegetable. Calling Leah a vegetable was, it seemed to me, just one more form of avoidance. In describing what had happened to her, he and Peggy both used the kinds of terms favored by the doctors in MASH. Gallows humor slang wielded in times of extreme stress on the theory that if you laugh at something it can't break your heart. Leah got gorked. She crumped. She fried her brain. She vegged out. She crapped out. She went to hell. No one's at home. The lights are out. The first nurses. Note after Leah's admission read. Pulse rate fast at 130, has a temp of 102 degrees. Offers no recognition or acknowledgement. NG tube in place. Then, without comment, family in room and shaman performing a ceremony. When I asked Gloria Rodriguez, Leah's nurse during that shift, about that note, she said, "Oh, yeah. They had a medicine man come in. He brought some kind of white ointment, and they chanted and rubbed it all over Leah. It smelled like vodka. And herbs. I remember her mom wouldn't let us give her a bath because that would take off the white stuff." In any case, Foua preferred to care for her daughter herself. She sat by Leah's bed around the clock. Mother encouraged to hold child while linens changed. Noted a nurse. Mother stroking chanting to child. The nurses showed her how to apply Vaseline to Leah's cracked lips. Rub Desitin on her diaper rash. Cool her forehead with a moist washcloth. Suction her secretions. And feed her formula through a nasogastric tube. Once, Foua and Nao Kao brought in an herbal remedy, a thick, stringy, gooey, gross, green liquid. As Peggy remembered it and tried to feed it to Leah. When they realized Leah couldn't swallow, they decided to pour it down the nasogastric tube. And Peggy, certain Leah would die anyway, instructed the nurses to let them do so. The Hmong New Year, a multi-day holiday that is traditionally celebrated in the 12th month of the year, starting at first cock crow on the first day of the waxing moon, happened to fall during Leah's stay at MCMC. It is the most important and merriest holiday of the Hmong year, a time to banish harmful dabs, ask for the assistance of benevolent household spirits, summon home the souls of dead ancestors, and, in general, secure good fortune for the coming year. It is also a time to dance, sing, play courting games, and dress in embroidered finery, which, even in America, many Hmong women start sewing months in advance. It is thought that anyone who wears old clothes at New Year's will bring poverty on the family. That year, Foua had made new pine top for all her daughters, using Thai cloth worked with American thread and decorated with antique Indochinese coins. She showed these garments to me once. Leah's skirt was by far the fanciest, with embroidered stripes of pink, green, and black, and pleats so numerous and fine they looked like the gills of a mushroom. These are the clothes Leah was going to wear. She told me. They were the most beautiful clothes because we loved her so much. No one else is allowed to wear them because they are Leah's and only Leah's. I made them because I thought Leah was going to be up and running around our house at New Year's. But she got sick instead. So she didn't wear them. And it was the only time in our lives that we ever missed the New Year's celebration. Mei Li said. We didn't do anything at New Year's. Not even the soul-calling ceremony. Because the doctors told us Leah was going to die and my family was just crying all the time. Instead, Foua brought a different set of clothes to the hospital. Funeral garments. It is Hmong culture to do that, explained Nao Kao. For us Hmong, if you don't dress them up, then after they pass away, you always dream of them being naked. It is not really good to see a person naked. So we dress them in special clothes. Leah's mother sewed them for her. The special clothes were a black hat, a black jacket, and a high-waisted, appliqued skirt. The nurses told Foua that Leah couldn't actually wear the jacket, since they needed access to her upper body. So at first Foua laid it over her daughter's hospital gown. Later, when the nurses were out of the room, she disobeyed instructions and dressed Leah properly. Leah's room was always crowded with siblings, cousins, uncles, aunts, and members of the Li and Yang clans who had traveled from out of town to join what one nurse's note called the vigil. Though some nurses did their best to be sympathetic, most were exasperated by the unremitting commotion. Those people would all yak and raise their voices and gesticulate at each other. Recalled a nurse named Evelyn Marcial. They were totally fed up with us. They'd ask us what were we doing. Why were we doing it? There wasn't a question asked that hadn't been answered 10 times over. Anything we were doing was wrong. Dee Corda also came frequently. Peggy remembers her sitting next to the bed crying, and Janine Hilt was there every day. There was usually no interpreter. Janine recalled. But you know, Foua and I communicated more through the soul anyway. We held each other a lot. When someone was there to translate, Foua and Nao Kao always talked about how much they loved Leah and how special she was to them. I told them how special she was to me too. The only thing I was thankful for is that it had not happened at the foster home. That had been my worst fear. That she would have a massive seizure in foster care. God. It could have happened so easily. And if it had, they would have blamed me forever. It would have had ramifications throughout the Hmong community. CPS steals children and they die. On Leah's second day back at MCMC, Nao Kao demanded that Leah's subclavian line, a central intravenous line placed with great difficulty at Valley Children's Hospital, be removed. And all her medications discontinued. Peggy noted in Leah's progress record. I held a long discussion with both parents through aid of an interpreter. CPS worker Janine Hilt was present. Parents understand that the antibiotics are fighting a severe infection and that without medication Leah may get her infection back and die sooner. They understand that once we remove Four, a new line will not be replaced. They understand and still refuse medication. Therefore, meds 4 will be withdrawn. The impression I had, recalled Peggy, was that they wanted Leah to be peaceful and not be persecuted anymore. Basically, they wanted her to die with dignity. Peggy was mistaken. She thought that Foua and Nao Kao wanted to withdraw the medicines because they were artificially prolonging Leah's life. In fact, though the Lees believed Leah was so sick she might die, they wanted to stop treatment because they thought it was the medicines that were killing her. After the 4 line was taken out, Foua and Nao Kao announced that they wanted to take Leah home. Her brain damage had fouled up the homeostatic mechanisms that regulated her body temperature, and she was spiking fevers as high as 107.4 degrees, which is potentially fatal. Peggy therefore informed the Lees that Leah needed to stay at MCMC for a few days of observation. I was sure she was dying, she recalled. But that's the quandary of Western medicine, that you can't let people die. Concerned that Leah be kept comfortable during her final days, Janine wrote the following memo. To Ernst Philp. From Hilt. Leah going home. Before we let Leah go home, let's re-evaluate the family's desire to do this. Are they physically, emotionally and financially able to take this on? Do they have a bed, linen, prescribed food, stethoscope, pampers, etc., on hand? They must have all this, plus home health nursing in place before I'm ready to say okay. Are you convinced that they can feed Leah properly? Have they accurately demonstrated their understanding and skill? Will they feed her every 4 hours? By December 9th, Janine and Peggy had arranged for home nursing visits and for all the necessary supplies, including a suction machine to clear Leah's secretions and, as Dave Schneider noted, a large supply of diapers as child is incontinent and presently having diarrhea. A nurse wrote the following discharge instructions. Glassrock. Health services will be by at 8:00 p.m. tonight. Give them prescription. Make sure to come to clinic this Thursday, Dec. 11th at 8:00 a.m. Keep egg crate mattress pad on at all times. Turn her every 2 hours so she does not get infected bed sores. Suction her as often as necessary. Diet instructions. Feed formula every 4 hours during daytime, 5 feedings a day, 10 ounces 5 times a day. All foods or medicines go down tube. Foua didn't understand the instructions, and in any case had no intention of giving Leah medicines or anything else through a nasogastric tube, which was intended to circumvent Leah's impaired sucking and gag reflexes and keep food from going down her trachea. Nonetheless, she signed the line that read, "These instructions have been explained to me and I understand them." Her signature, just as it had been when she signed the discharge papers after Leah's birth at MCMC 4.5 years earlier, was the single word FOUAYNG. At some point that day, Nao Kao was also asked to sign something. It is not included in Leah's chart, so no one knows exactly what it was. Although it probably had to do with the Lee's decision to withdraw her from MCMC, it is likely that Nao Kao was told that in 2 hours, after the discharge paperwork was completed, she would be released, and he could take her home to die. His interpretation was somewhat different. He recalled, one person gives Leah medicine, this was probably Tylenol for her fever. which the nurse's notes indicate that father refused. And then another person comes and has a paper on a clipboard and makes me sign and says that in 2 hours, Lia is going to die. They weren't fixing her. I thought even if they fix her she is going to die here. And if they don't fix her, she is going to die here. So I might as well just bring her home right now so the older children can see her. I am not satisfied. I am very disappointed at the hospital. I am mad. Is this a hospital that fixes people or makes them die? This was not the first time in the last 2 weeks that the Lees had been told Lia would die. But for some reason, perhaps because Nao Kao believed it contained such a time-specific prediction, it was the most offensive. In the Hmong moral code, foretelling a death is strongly taboo. It is an unpardonable insult to say to one's aged grandparent, after you are dead. Instead, one says, when your children are 120 years old. I asked several Hmong people I knew how they would feel if a doctor told them their child was going to die. A doctor should never say that, exclaimed Chong Mua, a mother of 3. It makes the dab come closer to the child. It is like saying okay, take her, kua her, an interpreter for the health department said, in Laos, that means you're going to kill a person, maybe poison him, because how do you know for certain he's going to die unless you're going to kill him? One night, I told Bill Selvage that the Lees had perceived the doctor's comments not as candid prognosis but as threats. I'm not surprised, he said. All those verb tenses. Lia will die. Lia might die. Lia has a 95% chance of dying. Those nuances would be very confusing through an interpreter, and if the parents thought that people at MCMC were saying Lia should die, maybe they were right. I imagine there were a lot of people here who thought that if Lia was comatose and couldn't communicate, and the only sensation she could feel was pain, it would be better for her if she did die. When Nao Kao thought he was being forced to sign a piece of paper that said his daughter was going to die in 2 hours, he did what any Hmong in an impossible corner, starting with the legendary she Yee might consider doing. He fled. He grabbed Lia, who was dressed in her funeral clothes, from her bed in the 3rd-floor pediatric unit and started running down the stairs. One of the nurses called a codex. Every hospital has a set of emergency codes that are blared over the public address system. Code blue for dying patients in need of resuscitation. Code red for fire. Code X for secure. ITY breaches. Nao Kao recalled. They were chasing after me. They called 2 policemen, hospital security guards, and they wanted me to go back to the hospital. When they called the police, the lady that told me that Lia was going to die came to scold me and said, "What are you doing?" At that time I was so angry I pushed that nurse and her head went blah. Dave Schneider was paged. Stat, that is. Urgently and immediately. It was late Friday afternoon at the end of what had already been a bad week for him, and it was about to get worse. Exhausted by the stresses of being a resident, the 33-hour shifts, the constant hectoring of resentful patients, the fear of making a fatal mistake, Dave had requested a 3-month leave of absence from MCMC, and had only a few days, which he had hoped would be calm. Before he left, I was about as low as I had ever been in my entire life, he told me, and I was in no state to put up with any bullshit from a father, whether he was a caring, concerned father who had customs that were different from mine or not. I mean, I really was not particularly feeling like having a discussion with him about cultural differences. When Dave arrived, at a run, on the pediatric floor, the security guards had already escorted Nao Kao and Lia back to her room. They'd found this Laotian guy carrying out this basically motionless child. And when I got there, they and the nurses were all yelling at him in a language he didn't understand. I didn't yell at him, but I was very angry. What really pissed me off is that he had pulled out her NG tube. He denied it, but it had been thrown onto the stairs. Obviously they wanted to take Lia home and let her die, and we were willing to do that, but it had to be in a medically acceptable manner. Not by starving her to death, which is what would happen if she didn't have an NG tube. So we'd instructed them as to how to use it and everything. Then the father rips her off, runs down the stairs, and takes out the tube. I mean, they had minutes to go, or at most an hour or 2, before we were going to let them take her home anyway, but they just couldn't fucking wait. In a sharp voice, Dave told Nao Kao over and over again that if he'd been patient, Lia could have left soon, but now she couldn't. because the nasogastric tube had to be reinserted and then x-rayed to confirm its position. In fact, the new tube was inserted incorrectly, and it had to be repositioned and x-rayed a second time. This, plus the paperwork, took nearly 4 hours. The hospital staff, including the nurse Nao Kao, had pushed against the wall. She hadn't been hurt, went about their business as if the incident, which they later referred to as the abduction, were an everyday event. Though they were all furious, no one considered reporting Nao Kao for assault or preventing him at what they decided was the appropriate time. From taking his daughter home, Leah left MCMC at 10:15 p.m. in her mother's arms. At the time of her discharge, her temperature was 104 degrees. Her parents carried her back to their apartment, took off her funeral clothes, and laid her on a shower curtain they had spread on the living room floor. Leah was going to die if she stayed in the hospital, said Nao Kao, but we boiled up some herbs and we washed her body. At the hospital she was so sick that when she was sleeping on the bed, she sweated so much her bed got all wet. She had too much medicine and her body just gave way. But then we boiled the herbs and we washed her and her sweat stopped. And she didn't die.